Welcome to the Psychology Podcast, where we give you insights into the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity. I'm Dr. Scott Barrett Kaufman, and in each episode I have a conversation with a guest who will stimulate your mind and give you a greater understanding of yourself, others, and the world we live in. Thanks for listening, and enjoy the podcast. Today, I'm really excited to have Dr. Kennon Sheldon on the podcast. Dr. Sheldon is a psychologist at the University of Missouri who studies motivation, goals, and well-being from both a self-determination theory and a positive psychology perspective. He has authored or co-authored multiple books, including Optimal Human Being, an integrated multi-level perspective. Dr. Sheldon has been cited more than 30,000 times, and in 2010, he was named one of the 20 most cited social psychologists. What an honor it is today to chat with you.
Hey, it's great to be here. It's been a long time that I've been kind of following your work, and we've never bumped into each other, so this is a great thing.
I have been a long time admirer of your work, so it feels really good when someone says that. Yeah, I devoured your book, Optimal Human Being. It was just the level of nerdiness that resonates with me. I almost crave that level, of integration of multiple perspectives. It was a really brilliant book. So thank you for writing that.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So let's go back. Let's go back to 1981. Okay, I was 2 years old, and you graduated from college, and you started to become interested in the topics of creativity, genius, and intelligence, which is what I started off in my career studying.
Yeah, those topics have always been fascinating to me. The question of how to get the most out of one's own mind and one's own potentials to, be as creative and as insightful and as whatever as possible. I really like to think about that.
So I'm trying to think about who were the major researchers in the field at that time. Dean Simonton, I think he was doing good work in then, right?
I didn't meet Dean until 1986 when I started a PhD program at UC Davis. And he was actually the one that sponsored me. He was the only person that accepted me. I applied to 7 programs and I got 6 rejections. But I found myself at UC Davis working with Dean Simonton. It was a great place to be.
Wow, that is a great place to be. Wow, so you worked with Dean Simonton. So tell me some of the research you did. Was your PhD thesis related to genius?
Actually, I should say that we didn't work together that long. I didn't really take to the historiometrical approach. We were in contact, but I was kind of adrift for a while at UC Davis. And I didn't really get my feet under me until Bob Emmons was hired at UC Davis. He was the personal strivings guy, a goal researcher. And I immediately gravitated to his work when he got there in my 4th year. And then my dissertation research was a goal study related to creativity and creativity issues.
Cool. And you also were you started a rock band? Is that around that time?
That was before I went back to grad school. There was about a 5-year period when I was trying to be a musician, kind of flailing a little bit. It turns out that it's very difficult to just find people in the musical community who are on the up and up, that are mature and really ready to go, or maybe I just, gave up too soon. But there were numerous band traumas and conflicts and dramas, and at some point I decided I'm going to grad school, forget this.
What did you play?
Keyboards, yeah.
Oh, wow. That was big in the 80s.
Yeah, there was the new wave style of music back then.
It's electric keyboard.
Yep, synthesizers.
Oh, wow, that's so cool. Do you miss those days at all?
Not at all. I think back on them fondly, but there's a real sense in which life is just kind of keeps getting better and better. Going from, you know this, you go from being not really sure who you are or what you're doing, if you can be successful, and then it starts to look like maybe this is going to work out. And at this point, it pretty much has worked out, and that's a very nice place to be.
I'm very happy to hear that. Okay, so when did you make contact with humanistic psychology, which has been a clear source of inspiration for both of our work?
Probably just the introduction to personality course back at Duke University, which happened to be taught by Tim Wilson, who's now very well known. He was a postdoc at that time at Duke. Now he's at UVA, but I don't think he's much of a humanistic type of guy, but he did a nice job of presenting that perspective, and it always resonated with me.
Yeah, and what's interesting, though, is it resonated with you, and you've done some really tremendous work on happiness, which was not really the major focus of the humanistic psychologists, right? Like a lot of them kind of even railed against the search for happiness. Well, so let's talk a little bit how you got interested in the topic of happiness, and also, just like I want to ask the question: why is everyone trying so hard to be happy? Is it worth it, that pursuit?
Yeah, well, those are really good questions. For me, I got interested in happiness because that's what Bob Emmons was studying when he got to UC Davis. He had been an Ed Diener student, and of course, Ed Diener is the guru of happiness and well-being. To me, it seemed like a much easier thing to study than creativity, which I had been studying. As you know, measuring creativity is quite difficult, and there's lots of ways to do it, and you're not sure that any of them is really valid.
It's a mess.
It's a bit of a mess. But with happiness, there's pretty good measures. They're reliable. They're valid. The main problem with happiness is people question how important is that? Why should we care about it? And my answer to that question is we should pursue growth and development and being the best, most creative person we can be. And happiness comes along as a side effect of that. So in the field, there's a lot of confusion about what well-being is, what's the right definition. From my point of view, we have a big problem because the definition of happiness is becoming so big and so many things now fit under that umbrella. I once did a lit search about a year ago on the term eudaimonic well-being, which is kind of this vague word to describe really any positive psychology construct. And it turns out that people are using that concept so broadly and so widely that to me, it's threatening to make the concept of happiness almost meaningless. Happiness becomes whatever the researcher says it is, as long as it kind of sounds good. Any old random positive psychology construct can be lumped in with the concept of happiness just by calling it a eudaimonic well-being measure.
That's a really good point. I think about, a lot of people in the field of positive psychology have been trying to use the term well-being instead of happiness as the umbrella term. Well-being being being all these same things that you just mentioned are attributed to eudaimonic well-being,
Yeah.
or sometimes just referred to as simply well-being, whereas happiness might be considered more hedonism.
Yeah, I don't like that trend. We could probably go on this, but to me, subjective well-being, which I can also call happiness, to me, they're almost interchangeable. SWB is something you don't get by being narcissistic, by being self-centered and selfish. A lot of my career has been dedicated to showing what brings you subjective well-being, and it turns out to be all the eudaimonic stuff that gets it for you. So I like to make a distinction between what people do and how they feel as a result. And to me, subjective well-being is a positive feeling that it's not just about pleasure, it's not just about momentary superficial stuff. It's really difficult to get that good feeling, and it's very comforting that the main way to get it is through doing virtuous, moral, growth-oriented types of activities.
Oh, well, I definitely want to get to all that good stuff later. We're not quite there yet in terms of what all those activities are, but yeah, I'm glad you said that. By the way, we just submitted a paper that showed that life satisfaction measures are positively correlated with narcissism. Narcissists do tend to report themselves, on average, as having higher subjective well-being, while they don't tend to score as high on other metrics of meaning, and they scored lower on metrics of meaning and purpose, for instance. There does seem to be an important distinction to be made there.
There could be. Yeah, I haven't seen that data. I usually don't find any connection between narcissism and subjective well-being measures, but it sounds like you are finding some association with life satisfaction. So
yeah.
I might need to think about that.
Yeah, well, hopefully it gets published, and would love to send you the paper. We can keep talking about it. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to take this moment to thank you for your support of this podcast over the years. It's been a lot of fun doing this podcast for over the past 3 years. If you'd like to further support the podcast, I wanted to let you know a few things you could do to make it a better experience for you all. First, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the show on iTunes. This would help make the show more prominent on iTunes and increase our listenership. I believe you can subscribe both on your phone and on your computer. Second, it'd be great if you could give the show a rating and review on iTunes. I definitely read all the reviews. Another thing you can do is donate some money to the show by going to thepsychologypodcast.com and clicking on the link Support the Podcast at the bottom of the page. That's thepsychologypodcast.com. Some of you had been noting that the audio quality was less than optimal. Thanks to the donations that we've been receiving, I'm really excited to announce that in the next couple of weeks, we're going to have a completely revamped audio structure to the show, and you should notice a huge improvement in the audio quality. Thanks for your patience with that. Thank you for your support of the show over the years. It's been a real labor of love for me. Okay, back to the show. Okay, so going back to happiness, now you've studied a lot about happiness. You asked this question, how can we keep ourselves in the upper end of happiness set point range? There is a big controversy, like, is happiness in your genes, right? And then people try to reconcile by saying, well, yes, but it's really just a set point. It's kind of like, what is your default? But there's still a good range that we can change. And then you are asking the question, how can we keep ourselves in the upper end? See, it's funny because when I hear that question, I kind of shudder because I don't want to be kept in the upper end of happiness. Like those people who are always like trying so hard to keep themselves in that upper end are really annoying people to me. They're the kind of people that I don't want to be around. They don't seem to be authentic to me. Now, am I totally being unfair?
Yes.
Good.
Well, I mean,
Good.
maybe. All right,
Tell
so
me why.
I would use myself as an example.
Okay.
I'm not a real ebullient, enthusiastic person. I'm not very high on extroversion. So I would say that my set point, such as it is somewhat lower than many people. But I consider myself to be doing quite well in my life because I'm keeping myself in the upper end of my potential range, mainly by doing a lot of cool stuff and having a lot of good experiences. So I think it's important not to mix up. So I agree with you. We should not be trying to make ourselves happy. We should be trying to do enjoyable, interesting, meaningful things.
Gotcha.
And I think the problem is many eudaimonic researchers think that if we say subjective well-being is a criterion that we can use to identify positive ways of being, that makes it the goal. I wouldn't say that at all. It's just a side effect. So circling back around, just because you're in the top part of your range doesn't mean that you have to be an annoying person who's happy all the time. It just means that you have raised your baseline level to a higher level than you otherwise would be, but you're still going up and down around that level. So you're still having bad days, you're experiencing grief. I had a really good friend die unexpectedly a couple of weeks ago, and that drug me down for a long time, and I'm still kind of adjusting to that. So it's just a question of, what are you going up and down around? Are you going up and down around a 3, or have you constructed a life that's full of enough interesting, meaningful experiences that now you're going up and down around a 4?
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. And so you've studied some of these things, right? So I like the idea of happiness as an epiphenomenon. I like that. But what are some of the things that you've studied help to contribute to keeping us in that upper end of the happiness set point range?
Well, there could be a lot of answers to that question, but the two main ones I would say come out of self-determination theory of motivation, which has been my primary focus. And in that theory, there's an important distinction between what you try to do, what are your values, what do you think is important, the content of your goals and motives on the one hand, and then there's why do you try to do them on the other hand. So there's the what and the why of motivated behavior. And what I find is that parallel with Tim Kasser's work on intrinsic versus extrinsic aspirations, pursuing intrinsic values of growth, connection, contribution, rather than extrinsic values of money, image, status. That's one important source of happiness, to be doing things that lets you be making connections to other people and making connections to your own deeper self. But then on top of that, you need to be doing them for the right reasons as well. So if you can bear with me for another second, I'd like to use the example of a stockbroker and a philanthropist. So a stockbroker is pursuing money pretty much. So he has extrinsic goals, that is, the content of the goals involving making money. A philanthropist, the content of his or her goals involve helping other people and doing good. So we would expect the philanthropist to be a happier person than the stockbroker just based on Tim Kasser's findings and some of my own findings. But what if that philanthropist is doing that activity because he feels guilty about his inherited wealth, or he's trying to impress his liberal friends and show how much, how awesome he is? That's not a good reason to be doing that activity. So the motivation would be good, check, but the why of motivation, not so good. That would tend to kind of cancel out the effects. So in this model, the happiest person would be the philanthropist who's doing it for the self-determined reasons. That's autonomous reasons. I enjoy it. I believe in it. I identify it with it. And the least happy person, and the data support this pretty cleanly, would be the stockbroker who is doing it with a feeling of pressure, social comparison, wanting to outcompete other people. So if you take both the what and the why into account, you can say that the happiest person would be the one who's doing good stuff for good reasons. And the least happy would be, by bad, and good and bad I don't mean in a moralistic sense, but just from the standpoint of what the data show. The least happy person would be the one doing extrinsic or not so good things for not so good reasons. I'll just stop there and let you react to that.
No, I like that. I try to map on some of these terms. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of the intrinsic-extrinsic distinction, but, I like to go back to the way Maslow framed it, security versus growth needs. I think you could map it on to saying that there's things that lead to growth, and those are the things that tend to make us feel happier than the things that we do to just fulfill some sort of desperate need or some hole that's within us.
Right. And I would agree with that. And I would just say that insecurity can lead you to pursue goals that are not very growth promoting, but they can also lead you to do things for reasons that are not very growth promoting. So from my point of view, SDT breaks the insecure functioning concept down into both what are you doing and why are you doing it? And I think that can be useful for some kinds of research questions.
Absolutely. I really like the distinction between what, why, and I also like the how part as well, right? So, how do we self-regulate ourselves and make sure these things aren't getting in the way of reaching these higher level or growth-oriented goals? There's something that a lot of people don't know. Well, some people might not even heard of self-determination theory. Let's not assume anything here. Would you mind just giving a brief overview of self-determination theory, and then we can get to some of the deeper nuances of it?
Okay, I'll try to do this pretty quickly. Ed Deci back in the early 1970s was an industrial organizational psychologist who had the radical idea that rewards like pay and money, instead of reinforcing behavior, might actually punish it. And he discovered what's called the undermining effect, that you can give people, say, $1 for each puzzle they solve, and then leave them alone with the puzzles, and they don't want to solve any more puzzles compared to people who are just told to do it for fun, do it for the fun of it. So that was the undermining effect. And really the entire theory, SDT, is built on that, trying to explain that effect. And the explanation turned out to be people have a need for autonomy. They need to feel like they're doing what they want to be doing for their own reasons. And when some authority comes along, or some boss or teacher, and tries to kind of bribe us to get us to do what they want us to do by offering us rewards or praise or the threat of criticism, that thwarts the need for autonomy and sort of spoils that activity for us, undermining the intrinsic motivation that we started out. So SDT has gone on to build a lot of different kinds of themes and variations on that basic idea, but they're all roughly consistent, that we want to be doing what is interesting and meaningful to us, that the environment gets us away from that. There's a lot of different ways, media, consumer advertising, the ways that authorities try to control us and coerce us. So it's a quest for self-determination that's at the core of the theory.
That's great. And so there are basic needs that are part of self-determination theory as well, right? The need for relatedness, competence, and autonomy. Now, how do those needs interact with the intrinsic-extrinsic part?
The original thought was that thwarting the need for autonomy would undermine intrinsic motivation, but then it turned out that feeling incompetent will also do it, and that fits right in with Csikszentmihalyi's flow theory. Csikszentmihalyi said we need to have a balance between the challenge of the task and the skill and our skills, so that the skills match the challenge and we can stay in the flow zone and feel competent in doing the task. It's pretty clear that that also is important for maintaining intrinsic motivation. And then if you're building a theory of basic needs, you really can't leave out relatedness or belongingness or connectedness, whatever you want to call it. So that's where the theory ended up. It's resistant to going beyond those three. just because of a parsimony perspective. I'm sure, as you know, it's tempting to say, what about a need for this and this and this and this? And that can get out of hand pretty quickly. So ideally, you have some kind of a way of testing and comparing the candidate needs to figure out which ones really are most important and which ones might be just a rephrasing in some sense of one of the existing ones.
Well, as you know, I do believe it's not a complete model of needs, but even without just taking my own thinking about this out of the picture, your own work has shown there's two additional candidate needs that really ought to be part of the theory, the need for security and the need for self-esteem. Aren't I right that your work has shown that both of those two are really important as well?
I would agree with you that there's sort of a two-level thing going on where security is important. It seems to be mainly a deficit need. It becomes important when it's taken away, whereas SDT is more of a positive experiences that you need, but it also has a deficit perspective. So, I might put security in a different category there. I'm not sure what DC and Ryan would say. Self-esteem is trickier.
It's a tricky one, yeah.
It's a really tricky because
yeah.
It's a feeling that it's great to have, but if you're going after it, that's not such a great position to be in. Jenny Crocker has done some important work showing that self-esteem striving tends to work against itself, tends to backfire in the end. Self-esteem striving is a lot like extrinsic values, what Tim Kasser studies. It's about getting status, getting ahead, looking good, or it can be about that. So it's more of a mixed case, self-esteem striving.
Yeah, been thinking about this a lot. I certainly don't have all the answers, but I think that it's worth debating. Couldn't one make the case that if you strive for belonging, that's not really healthy either? Like, there are a lot of people who have a constant need to belong, and it comes from a place of deprivation and neediness, and people don't respond well to people are signaling.
That's absolutely true. I think you have to make a distinction between chronic and acute deprivation. So if it's Friday night and I, kind of hanging out by myself and I'd like to find some other folks to hang out with, and I pick up the phone and say, hey, what are you doing? That's not coming out of deprivation. That's just reaching out to satisfy a need. But if you're in a place where you feel lonely and that's a chronic feeling, I think you're right that people do pick up on that you're needy and you're trying to use them as a way to satisfy your need, and they don't respond as well to it.
I agree, and I think that's why there's value in distinguishing healthy and unhealthy manifestations of these things, but that doesn't argue against the value of adding. So, for instance, I think I could make a case that a healthy self-esteem is actually an essential core part of being human, of having autonomy, of having growth. And to me, I would just define that simply as having self-respect for yourself, having confidence. To me, it's not the same as competence. I'm talking about basically the self-liking versus self-competence model. Like, liking yourself, to me, seems to be essential. So in a healthy way, then there's an unhealthy manifestation of that, which you see with narcissism, which you see with those who have an addiction to esteem. But I'm not talking about that. It just seems like any one of these self-determination theory things could have a healthy or unhealthy version, and that doesn't argue against the inclusion of these other things.
Yeah, no, that could be. I see what you're saying. I think that DC and Ryan would argue that pursuing self-esteem directly is likely to fail in its aim, but maybe it comes down to an empirical question.
Yeah, just more research and distinguishing between these. I think it's a really important distinction, though, between the healthy and unhealthy flavors of each of these needs and how we regulate these needs.
Yeah. Well, I remember what I was going to say a second ago. DC and Ryan would say that self-esteem is an outcome of getting the big three needs met, and that's an empirical question that could be studied. But why would your liking of yourself even come into question unless you were around people that didn't respect you and didn't take you seriously? So that would be absence of relatedness need set. Or if you weren't doing what was important and meaningful to you, if you were doing things that you felt controlled and coerced into doing, you might also not really respect yourself.
This is a question, like, I could talk all day about this topic. It's so rich and exciting to me because I see these things kind of building off each other in ways. The fundamental need for belong is intimately, as Mark Leary has shown, is intimately tied to the self-esteem. There are like multiple things that can lead to higher feelings of self-esteem. There are multiple indicators, or if self-esteem is an outcome, which is how Leary likes to look at it, there are multiple things that feed into that. It does seem like if there's an overall, not self-esteem, but I think there is a fundamental overall need for esteem. Abraham Maslow, posited the need for esteem in his self-actualization framework. If you view the need for esteem as something that includes not just how you feel about yourself, but the esteem you get from others, that's not in the relatedness or competence purely. That's not in there. The esteem that you're getting from others. Like, let's not deny just how good it feels to be respected by others for your competence, not just to have the competence. You see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying, and I agree. We could go back and forth on this.
It's kind of fun.
Me, it is. I mean, to me, the problem with self-esteem is yourself as an object that you want to feel good about that object. It might be taking you out of the moment, taking you out of flow, might reflect some problematic interpersonal experiences in the past or in the present. Why do you even need to think about how good you feel about yourself if, you're getting good connection, you're doing well, you're doing what you want? I don't really think about my self-esteem very much. Maybe I don't have to. Maybe I've been, things are working out well enough for me that just doesn't come up. But that's part of the point. If it comes up, doesn't that mean that there's something going on that is non-optimal, which means it's a deficit response, perhaps?
Yeah, it's a great point. And maybe just like a way of resolving that, which is my kind of preferred situation, is to make this distinction between deprivation needs and growth needs, as Maslow did. Like, I really love that distinction. And I would actually argue that relatedness is a deprivation need, though. Like, I would argue belonging belongs in the camp of deprivation. Whereas what the kind of more growth-oriented forms of relatedness that Maslow was talking about was not relatedness. It was like universal sort of benefit to the good of society, or he called it being love, loving for the being of others, regardless of whether it's your mother or your partner or that you belong in a certain group. I would actually argue that the need for belonging is actually a deprivation need. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do see what you mean. If you think of it as like group acceptance, and
correct,
I'm a 13-year-old, and do correct, the cool kids like me or not? The way SDT thinks about relatedness, I do think it's seen as a deeper thing. It's kind of like the distinction between the need for affiliation and the need for intimacy from motive disposition theory. Yeah. Affiliation is be accepted, be fit in. Intimacy is go deeper. In SDT, the relatedness is supposedly aligned with the deeper part, but it's true you could go even deeper, and personally, I'm not sure that there's something different. There's just more elaboration of that same experience of feeling connected and close to somebody that you appreciate, they appreciate you, you're sharing something meaningful. That's what it's about.
So, I'm thinking of like George Vailant's work he wrote this book called Spiritual Evolution, and argue there's like different stages of evolution of love. First is like the belonging, then there's kind of like the intimacy, but then there really is a third, which is it's kind of a love for all of humankind. And I just don't see that really talked about enough, I guess, in the needs literature.
Yeah, I can see what you mean. What I would want to do is figure out how to measure it and then do the studies to compare it to the existing needs and find out, does it predict additional variance? And maybe it would.
Oh, gosh, I have that data set. Should I run it right now? I've been known on the Psychology Podcast to run studies on the spot. I've done that before with like, yes, I am that nerdy. It's true. Okay, I actually did collect this data set. I've been trying to come up with a new test of self-actualization that I could validate. And some of these kinds of more love for humankind is included on this scale, but I also included measures of self-determination theory. So I'm literally, let's see, what should we put in the dependent variable, like work satisfaction? I've never run this analysis. This is actually
well, see, that's one of the questions. What's the criterion?
Yeah, what's the criterion? Exactly.
And that's why I like subjective well-being, because it's relatively value-free. It's just, how do you feel? Are you satisfied?
I got it. I have that. Let's do it. Okay, I'm
Give it a shot.
Yeah, I have subjective well-being as the dependent measure. I'm going to put in, let's call it democratic character structure. Maybe that's one of the closest. I have I have 16 subscales on the self-actualization test. It seems like democratic character structure might be the closest thing to what I'm talking about, where you basically kind of like treating everyone as though they have value. To me, that's a form of love. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to put that in, and I'm going to put in the relatedness from the, didn't you create the scale, the satisfaction versus dissatisfaction SDT scale?
The one with Hilbert, John Hilbert.
it divides need for relatedness, competence,
Yeah,
autonomy into
yeah.
yeah, I'm literally putting into this regression a scale you created.
Okay, sounds awesome.
I'll put in the should I put the satisfaction or the dissatisfaction one or the overall global? For now, I'll put in satisfaction just for now.
Okay.
Okay, here we go. I'm going to run it. Wow, democratic character structure is no longer significant. Relatedness is the predictor there. Wow.
The STT thing would be that relatedness mediates its effects.
Okay.
The needs are always mediators, or very typically they're mediators. But I mean, I'm not saying, what's the end that you have there?
It's pretty large. It's almost 1,000. Okay, for instance, I don't think that was the fairest test. Like, I included a subscript I think is more relevant, which I call humanitarianism, is what I'm labeling. I think that's more of what I'm talking about. Okay. And I found that both the relatedness satisfaction and humanitarianism independently predict life satisfaction. So it's not the same thing. It can't be reduced to it.
No, maybe not. Yep.
So, okay, I did find that. That's a suggestive that this is possible.
I mean, it's a bit tricky doing this kind of test because A, you have to agree that SWB is the appropriate criterion.
Right.
And a lot of people don't, as we were talking about earlier. But B, just predicting independent variance in subjective well-being, you're going to find more than just self-determination theory's three needs. So it becomes a question of trade-off between parsimony and completeness. If you were going to go with just 3, which would they be? Or maybe just 5? You could answer those questions.
Right. No, for sure. So just like relatedness is part of it, I don't think that's the umbrella, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I think autonomy doesn't go far enough as it is. Like autonomy, to me, the umbrella of autonomy really is authenticity, whereas the umbrella of relatedness is love. And under both of those umbrellas, we have one facet, which is, so I guess that's how I'm conceptualizing it. And it just is, I don't know if I'm making any sense to you, how I'm thinking about it, but
it does make sense to go to sort of the purest, most intense version of the construct.
Yeah.
I think authenticity has problems. It's not really clear what it means. But some people say the same thing about autonomy. It can be kind of hard to define. So
yeah. So cool. This has turned out to be a lot of fun for me intellectually. I don't know if we've lost all our listeners at this point. I hope, gosh, we haven't. I hope they're enjoying this, us trying to kind of make sense of things. But let me move on because I would love to highlight more of your wonderful research. And specifically, like, it's funny, when I think of you, I don't think like the self-determination guy. That's not what I think of. You have your own unique spin on this, which is self-concordance theory, which you developed. So I think we really should dive into self-concordance theory because to me, that is more you. Like, that's more to me, self-concordance theory is what's more self-concordant with Ken Sheldon than to self-determination theory in general. Am I right?
Okay. Yeah, I like that. That's okay. Right. So because I studied personal strivings back in graduate school, which is what people write down on a blank sheet of paper that they say they're striving to do, I'm very interested in goals. And when I first got to Rochester as a postdoc, Rich Ryan didn't like goal constructs. Not even sure why he brought me there, actually, because he saw a goal as an external control that the person has brought inside themselves to beat themselves up with, right? And I saw a goal as a standard that you use to regulate your behavior to try to make positive changes. So I had that perspective on goals as a positive thing. But when I first got to Rochester and I asked people to rate, why are you pursuing these goals that you just wrote down on this blank sheet of paper, you would think that they would say, oh, they're meaningful, they're interesting, they're enjoyable. But a lot of people were saying, no, I don't enjoy it, I don't really believe in it, I'm just kind of have to do it. So I had to puzzle over that finding a lot because the goals were self-determined in a nominal sense. The person thought them up and wrote them down, but they didn't seem to be self-determined from a phenomenological feeling sense. And in order to figure that out, I came up with this idea that's really not that new, but the idea is that we're stuck up here in our conscious worlds in what we would now call System 2, trying to think of what to do, and we don't have very concrete, direct access to System 1, the world of implicit motives and potentials and growth impulses. So we can very easily confuse ourselves consciously into pursuing things that don't fit us at a deeper level. And so the self-concordance idea is an attempt to help people identify which of their goals are them. And it turns out that they're the ones that they have a lot of intrinsic motivation for, a lot of identified motivation for. I use these self-determination measures to get at the self-concordance question. But, it's just trying to find out if the goals reach all the way into you or not. Do they connect with a core, developing, growing self? Or are they something that's only gotten partly shoved into you by the environment, perhaps, that you think is what you're doing, but really you need to hopefully get some deeper insight and maybe change what you're doing.
I love that. So what are some of these characteristics of fit? Like if we could think of like design an artificial intelligence system that had like the optimal fit to a task, it would include your satisfaction of basic needs, your talents, your capacity. Like what is the total list of things here we're talking about?
It could be a very long list, and there needs to be more research. My 2014 review article called Becoming Oneself, the vital role of self-concordant goal pursuit, basically said it's kind of a mystery what's in there that the goals need to fit with. It could be self-actualization needs. It could be some other deep needs. It could be just the fact that if you ever somehow found yourself in front of a piano, and maybe you never have before, you would find that you could play by ear and you had all this talent that you didn't even know about. So it would be potentials and talents and values and interests that resonate deeply with the person.
So on as many levels as possible, is that the ideal? Like how does your work relate to harmonious versus obsessive passion, for instance, the Valran's work? Is there a good congruence there between how you're thinking about and how Valran's thinking about a harmonious passion?
Yeah, I think there is. That there's definitely a positive correlation between self-concordant motivation to do X and having harmonious passion to do it. Whereas obsessive passion is more about what STT would call it introjection. You're kind of making yourself do it. You're kind of obsessed with it. You're compulsive about it. So they are similar. The difference is that Valran sees those as personality styles to some extent, not really about goals, although you could adapt them to goals. The thing I love about his idea is that it was the first time that anybody ever asked, can intrinsic motivation be maladaptive?
Right.
And if you look around, it's pretty clear that it can. People who are addicted to social media, to violent video gaming, lots of other things. But self-determination theory didn't really have a way to talk about that. It just said intrinsic motivation, good. But here's a case where obsessive passion, you really love to do it, but you can't stop doing it. And so the absence of a stop rule is something that STT didn't really address before Bob Valran came along.
Cool. So going back to, let's say we found something that is very self-concordant and harmonious. So we tick both those boxes. What else should we take into consideration? Not just the self-concordance, but also like the content of the goals. Is that right? Is that something else that we should take into account?
Yeah, that would go back to the stockbroker versus the philanthropist example. And I'm not meaning to pick on stockbrokers, but it's kind of easy to understand.
Yeah.
So you'd be best off if you were able to be self-concordant as a philanthropist and maybe not quite as well off according to the data. Again, I'm not making a moral judgment. If you felt self-concordant in pursuing monetary or extrinsic type goals.
Okay, so let's talk about, give me that list there again of the goals that you have found, the type of goals. What are the categories conceptually that are most correlated with happiness and well-being?
Well, this really goes back to Tim Kasser's work. I was there when he was developing this way of thinking about things. He was coming out of the values tradition, Schwartz values, Rokeach, and so forth. And they were the first to ask the question, are some values healthier than others?
Right.
And the first thing they looked at was materialistic values versus others. And they found that people who strongly placed a lot of emphasis on materialism were not as high in well-being. And then the category became generalized to include not just money values, but also appearance values, status values, popularity, image. Those all hang together as a factor. And from the Maslow point of view, they're all kind of based in insecurity. Whereas the intrinsic values include connection, intimacy, contribution, service, personal growth. So they're not all social. They also involve getting the most out of yourself, but they all hang on a second factor. So you get a pretty solid two-factor structure when you look at most data that has a bunch of different types of values in it.
Beautiful. And I love that two-factor structure, which security and growth or however you want to label those factors. I love that. And you can tell I'm so appreciative of this conversation. I've been like following your work for so long that this is like I'm like a kid in a candy shop right now. I hope you understand like that I'm able to actually ask you these questions. So
well, there's not that many people that I run into who want to ask me these questions, so I appreciate it as well, Scott.
I doubt that, but so look, how can we link the Schwartz? I'm glad that you mentioned the Schwartz values because I'm trying to think of how that maps on to. You wrote this cool paper on the structure of goal contents across 15 different cultures. I thought that was a really brilliant paper. Like, how does that structure map onto the Schwartz values? Do they map on nicely? Can you actually tell me which of the Schwartz values would go in one camp or the other? I guess is what I'm asking.
To be honest, I'm not totally prepared to talk about that. I was a more of a minor author on that paper.
Oh, no problem.
One thing about the Schwartz model is it didn't try to cross that line that positive psychology crosses to say which one is, quote, better versus not so good.
Right.
And that's what Kasser was willing to try to do.
Yeah.
Schwartz would just take a matching perspective and he would say, doesn't matter what value you think is important, just whether you're kind of moving towards it or expressing it. And Tim would come along and say, well, it matters what the value actually is, not just whether you're successful at enacting it. I'm not sure what Schwartz would say about that now, though.
And that's what you're saying. I mean, it's funny you say Tim Kasser, but I think that's your argument. That's the self-concordance theory sort of argument. And that's so cool. I actually learned today that you studied with Tim Kasser. I didn't know that. So that makes a lot of sense. I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
Well, I don't want to take any credit for the intrinsic, extrinsic value distinction because that was him. But
of course.
I was there when he was coming up with it, and we did work even back then. So I feel some ownership of that distinction as well.
Totally. And I think that this self-concordance theory, though, does make a stand, in a sense, on certain – you don't use the word values, but that's what you're talking – I mean, these things are values. Like, if we just concretely here talk about the four major categories in Schwartz's values model, we have self-transcendence, self-enhancement, conservation, and openness to change. It seems to me like the two out of those four that are most conducive to growth are self-transcendence and openness to change.
Yes.
Now, why can't we make that argument and say, look, it does matter what the value is? Like, I have all this data, for instance, showing that the dark triad of personality, I'm actually trying to publish this right now. We're sending this out soon with my colleagues. The dark triad, which encompasses like psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, that is so strongly associated with the self-enhancement values and wholly uncorrelated with the growth, whole measures, like lots of measures of growth, even like you just take the RIF personal growth subscale, zero correlation with the dark triad. So maybe a broader question is how much can we garner our values through science?
The thing that changed when positive psychology came along was it became more acceptable to talk about the roots of thriving and growth and to start to make value judgments about what people were up to. But what I try to tell people is it's not a value judgment. It's just what the data say. So I'm not saying if you're a narcissist or a Machiavellianist that you shouldn't do that. But I would say, well, the data shows that that's not going to do so much for you.
I am on the same page as you. Same page. But I don't understand why we can't look at it from the same perspective of a doctor. You go to a doctor and you want to lower heart disease. What the doctor is telling you are recommendations that are based on scientific findings of what behaviors in life. We know that eating lots and lots of pizza is statistically less probable to fix your heart disease than eating celery sticks But I don't know. I'm just making that up. But I'm saying it seems that, if the science shows that's the case, then that's what the doctor says. So why can't we be doctors too in the same spirit? Why can't we be psychological doctors? Because that's what a psychologist is. But do you know what I'm saying, though?
I totally agree with you, but I think you take an additional step when you go beyond eat celery to endorse a certain type of value and not a different value. I mean, this stuff gets really politicized.
Yes.
I published one paper where I compared the values of Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah.
And this was data collected after the 2004 election, back when there was this idea that the Republicans were the family values party. And the finding was that Republicans and Democrats consistently differed on two values. The Republicans were lower in community service values and higher in materialism values. I had a hard time getting that published because it starts, and I was afraid that I was going to end up on Rush Limbaugh, being one of his punching bags or something. So that's different from telling people they should eat celery.
I do hear what you're saying, but I understand that these things do get politicized. So that makes it tricky. I agree 100%. But if we remove politics from it, like in the discussion, and we just talk about humanity, like what are the human values? I wonder if we can. I wonder if we could rise above politics. Like Maslow talks all the time about be values versus, being values, the values that come along with being itself, existence. That's the level at which I wish we had these discussions.
Yeah. No, I agree. And the paper I just mentioned is the only one I've ever published that mentioned politics explicitly. Usually I would stay away from that, but that election just irritated me so much I couldn't help myself. Yeah, so we can ask which activities, which goals, which motivations are associated with particular positive outcomes and just put that out there and let people make of it what they will.
Yeah. Or, it does get tricky. And at the very least, I think it's great to just have open, honest dialogue about it, at the very least. And what do the scientific findings show? How are certain people choosing to live their lives? Are there certain ways of being that are more conducive to happiness than others? These are important questions for science as well as that people or individuals are interested in. So your work has contributed to that. I'm just going to talk about another interesting paper of yours, it's in my top 10 favorite papers of yours. I know I sound like a fangirl right now, or fanboy, or whatever you want to call me, but that's maybe not a phrase that's used that often in science. But this paper you wrote where you tested Carl Rogers' notion of the organismic valuing process.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about Carl Rogers? Because I always loved Carl Rogers' notion of the organismic valuing process.
Yeah, the idea is that people have an ability to tell what are the most growth-relevant choices to make, but often not in touch with that ability. And so one of the things that Rogers would try to do with his clients would be to give them unconditional positive regard and get them into a safe, open state of mind where they could regain contact with this sort of deep implicit knowledge of the organismic valuing process. And it's a very kind of, new agey term, difficult thing to prove. And the way we tried to prove that there really is such a thing was just to a very simple method of ask people to rate what's important to them and then ask them to do it again, maybe just a few minutes later or a couple days later or a week later. And what you would expect is that the repeated measures of values would get the same results. It would just be test, retest. But what we found was that there was a biased shift towards the more intrinsic growth relevant values over time. That if people changed, it tended to be towards what Kasser calls the intrinsic values. And we saw that as at least some kind of evidence for the existence of this valuing process, whether you call it a bias towards growth or an ability to grow. It seems to be a real thing. But let me just do a quick follow-up. It's contingent. It might not be active, and there are circumstances where it can go the other way. So I've studied the effects of law school on law students.
Yeah.
And one of our findings is that their values tend to go the other way. They tend to become more extrinsic over time, which is not the usual trajectory, but it reflects the influence of what my collaborator thinks is a very toxic educational culture. So it's there, but you might not necessarily figure out how to get in touch with it, the OVP.
I love it. And you're also highlighting the importance of the culture, the society, the environment in bringing out and allowing us to listen to it or not, giving us the kind of autonomy, so to speak, to listen to it.
Yes.
So I really like that. Okay, so thanks for explaining that, and I thank you for testing a very old idea that no one else has seemed to care about in the field. I feel like me and you are the only ones that have ever used the word organismic valuing process in the field of positive psychology. How did you become interested in that?
Well, I just read old books by Carl Rogers. I actually kind of like him maybe as much or even more as Maslow.
Yeah, me too. I like them both.
Yeah, we don't need to compare, but they're both awesome. And as you know, one of the problems in positive psychology has been the attempt to distance itself from humanistic psychology, which came before. And I think that that's been to the loss of the field. Positive
Great.
psychology is not just reinventing all this stuff. What it's trying to do is be more scientific about some of these concepts. That I'm in favor of, but the marketing aspect of positive psychology sometimes is a bit off-putting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. But you wrote an article in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology where you argue that humanistic psychology and positive psychology could make a very happy marriage, right?
Yes.
I think that's like a direct quote of yours.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
I agree.
So I'm trying to think what's the relationship between self-concordant goals and personal projects like Brian Little's work. Did you interact with Brian Little at all? I really like him a lot, and I've
No, I know him. We used to talk quite a bit in email and various things. I haven't seen him in quite a while now, but he'd probably disagree with this. But to me, it doesn't really matter what you call an ideographic goal. So ideographic means the person writes it down on a blank sheet of paper. And that to me was a major advance in personality psychology back in the 1980s. Instead of giving people a questionnaire and forcing them to respond to what you think is important, let them tell you what they think is important. So there were several goal constructs that came out at about the same time: the personal striving, the current concern, the life task, and the personal project. So to me, it's all it's a little interchangeable, whether you call it a striving, a project, or a concern, although there are some differences based on the time frame potentially.
Right.
Whereas Brian thought of the project as a kind of a more special thing that was related to the context in certain ways, which I never quite got, so I won't try to explain them. But to me, it's really, you're letting the person tell you what they're trying to do, and that's the important thing.
Okay, and how does that relate to, the importance of having self-consistency versus psychological authenticity? Because personal projects is very much in the spirit that we can diverge from our personality, that we can have these free traits, as he calls it.
Yeah.
So do you see how I'm trying to reconcile that? Because it's not actually self-concordance. It doesn't have to
Right.
be self-concordant.
No. And this is actually a debate that he and I had quite a bit. He would tell these stories about free traits that he was able to set a project that went against his traits.
Right.
Although he seems to be incredibly extroverted. Maybe he is, I'm not sure. He feels like when he goes and gives a talk or is in a group of people that it's very stressful for him, as if he's really an intense introvert. So he says that he has the projects of being, very glib, very out there, but it takes a big physiological toll on him. But yet he is free to diverge from his own traits via his goals. And I agree with that we can set goals to become different people. The question is, are those goals self-concordant enough that you're ultimately going in a direction which is going to be good for you, or are you laboring under some delusion that you should be a certain way that's getting you to act very different from who you normally would be, and maybe you're just stressing yourself out for no good reason.
Yes, this is so great to be able to reconcile this. So I feel like we're on the verge of actually reconciling this. I've wanted to reconcile this for such a long time. Okay, so in your book, you talk about why it's important to modify aspects of your personality that are getting in the way of your higher level goals. Now, you do talk about that. So maybe the simple reconciliation here is that we can create personal projects in the service of our growth as a whole person, in the sense that they diverge from traits that we don't like about ourselves.
Yeah, so
is that a good reconciliation?
Yeah, I think so, because a trait, by definition, is sort of a habit or a behavioral predisposition, but it doesn't imply goals or values. So a person high in the trait of neuroticism is a great example. Should they be true to their trait and just let themselves worry and stress, or should they maybe set goals to try to be more mindful, learn how to relax, learn how not to overreact to things? So yeah, I think setting goals to change traits that are getting in your way is a great thing to do. The hard thing to know is, in the case of neuroticism, it's probably not too much value in that, although even there's theories. The hard thing to do is to know whether that's really the right thing for you versus right now you've just been led to a false conclusion. And maybe the only way to do it is to try it and find out.
Right. Maybe that's the point, is you should also be flexible in knowing when to change goals. So wouldn't that be it? That's something else that you argue in your book, right? Like it's not just important to set the goals or to have the content of the goals, but also to know when to fold them.
Yeah, and I don't study that so much. That's more Carson Roche and Mike Shire have studied that, and I think it's a really important question, knowing when to fold it, because how to tell the difference between copping out versus legitimately changing your focus. Like
Yeah.
if you give up too soon, you say, okay, I'm giving up on this, it's not working, it's not for me. But the really hard thing to know is whether you are making an adaptive change that makes sense versus you should keep going, even though it may not feel very great at the moment, but instead you're going to let yourself off the hook. It's really hard to tell that difference, I think.
Yeah, that's one of these things we don't really have a good measuring instrument to precisely let someone know whether it's one or the other.
Yeah.
But I would just go back to listen to your organismic valuing process. That would probably be what I'd say is, to constantly be listening to it. Like, don't get out of touch with it.
Yeah, I think that can be easier said than done.
Yeah.
I mean,
Good point.
It can be helpful to have techniques. The
Yeah.
mindfulness meditation, I think, is a great one to learn to recognize these little impulses or reactions on the fringes of consciousness, as William James would say,
Yeah.
and let them into your conscious awareness and try to figure out what they're telling you. Going with your gut is something you can make a conscious effort to try to do. But again, what if you think your gut is telling you that you have to do something that's going to hurt people or might be immoral? But I mean, it's just really hard to really know, I think.
I mean, isn't that the whole process or the point of becoming fully human is being open to all of your experience and trusting the totality of your experience? Like, to me, that just seems like that's just part of personality integration is being able to trust yourself at such a deep level that you can feel when you're doing something bad for yourself. You really trust it that you're making the poor decision.
We have an article under review, almost in press, I hope, that uses that idea. Instead of having people list goals first and then rate how self-concordant they are, now we're having them rate the potential self-concordance of a bunch of candidate goals and then picking a subset of that list of candidates. And the finding is that people are more likely to pick healthy intrinsic goals if they got the chance to rate the self-concordance of those goals beforehand. So I'll say that a different way. You're looking at a list of goals. What should I do? You don't know. How do you tell? You're saying, listen to your OVP, your valuing process. I would say, yeah, that sounds good, but how can you get it to give you a readout that you can hear? Well, one way to do it is to think in advance about how enjoyable it's going to be, how much you're going to believe in doing that goal, how much pressure or guilt you're going to feel in pursuing that goal. Just having the chance to think about your potential motivation, we've discovered as an experimental manipulation versus not getting that chance, leads people to pick more intrinsic well-being promoting goals. I'm not sure if that's clear, but
yeah, it is. I love it. Could you send me that paper when it's open
I'd be
for
happy
consumption?
to.
Yeah,
I'd
that
be happy
sounds.
to.
I love that. Maybe I can include one of those activities in my book as an activity for the reader. I really like that.
There's something similar to it in Sonia's book, The How of Happiness. She calls it assessing the fit of an activity with your personality. So you might take a look at that as well.
Absolutely, I will. I guess I'm just wondering, when we talk about the content of the goals are important, it's not a simple distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. There are some forms of extrinsic motivation that are growth oriented. Isn't that correct? Isn't that like kind of a major point of the relative autonomy spectrum?
Yes, but I would amend it this way. The relative autonomy spectrum has to do with the why of behavior, no matter what it is. Whereas I think you're talking more about the what, the content of the values. So you may not agree with this distinction, but it's an important one in SDT. So the why has to do with why are you doing it? And the finding is that whatever you're doing, you're brushing your teeth, you're going to the gym, you're writing a paper, that behavior can be located somewhere on a continuum between, at one extreme, I love it. It's fascinating. I wouldn't choose to be doing anything else. To the other extreme, I have to, I don't want to be doing it, but I'm forced to do it. But between those two extremes, there's gradations. So the continuum is about those gradations. And in the middle, pretty close to the dividing point between autonomous and controlled, is self-esteem motivation, which we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
I'm doing it because I want to feel good about myself. It's kind of like, I need to feel good about myself. I'm into my ego, but that one just barely falls on the autonomous side. So it's actually not a bad form of motivation, despite what Jenny Crocker would say, or it's not as bad. But it's not as healthy as the ones closer to the autonomous extreme.
Okay, tell me like the best. The best is the word.
Intrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
And SDT would say that's the growth motivation. And I know that's what you're concerned with. And you think maybe it doesn't capture that, and maybe it doesn't. But when it was proposed back in the 70s, it was a radical idea that a creature would do something just because it wanted to and was interested and liked to do it. It didn't fit with reinforcement theory. It didn't fit with drive theory. And really, that is how the theory thinks about it. That follow your intrinsic motivation. That's your growth impulse telling you what to do.
No, I want to be very clear. I owe a huge debt to self-determination theory. Not debt, but, a huge, whatever I'm trying to say. I really appreciate and respect, how foundational it was. And I want to make that clear. So I'll leave you today with one last question. The good life, well-being or well-doing?
Well-doing, to be sure. Absolutely. I mean, the goal is not to be happy. But it's really awesome that if we try to be the best, most open, inclusive, creative person we can be, we get happiness as a side effect. But as soon as we make that the goal itself, it undermines itself. That seems to be the finding.
I love it. Hey, thanks so much for chatting with me today and for the great work you've done for the field.
Thank you. It's really been a fun conversation. I hope we haven't boggled everybody too much with all these nerdish distinctions.
For those who've made it to the end of this episode, please let me know. Drop me a line or write in the comments and let us know what you thought of the episode. So thanks again.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks for listening to the Psychology Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to react in some way to something you heard, I encourage you to join in the discussion at thepsychologypodcast.com. That's thepsychologypodcast.com. Also, please add a rating and review of the Psychology Podcast on iTunes. Thanks for being such a great supporter of the podcast, and tune in next time for more on the mind, brain, behavior, and creativity.